Welcome back to the Captain's Commentaries. Today I'm going to be continuing my series on DMRs, and I will now be covering what I am going to be referring to as medium DMRs. And by all means, you're free to disagree with that nomenclature. I'm not trying to claim that that is the hobby standard or make it the hobby standard. I'm just using that to be able to designate the differences in these blasters for this series of videos. So this is what these are some of what I'm referring to as medium DMRs, and the designation there is the amount of power that they were meant to have at their time, so to speak. So some of these will actually probably have less power than some of the stuff that I classified as light DMRs, but that was because technology has changed since then. Now, I mentioned in the light video that the Alpha Trooper had a ceiling on how much power you could get out of it, and a large of that had to do with the priming rod, that if you tried to go beyond a certain spring weight, the priming rod would simply bend and the blaster would end up non-functional. And so the blaster that became the option we went to for a little bit more power was the Retaliator, or in this case, a Retalicon with an expanded plunger tube. And that's because we could now have direct prime. We could have a better priming system, and we were making them out of aluminum bars and whatever we could get our hands on back then, but allowed for a much heavier spring load and had a larger plunger volume. And so that is what we used. And eventually workers started coming out with better kits, this kind of pump kit, internal kits, breeches, half-dart kits, all kinds of stuff. And we were able to get a decent amount of power out of this for the time. It was fairly impressive. Compared to numbers we get nowadays, yeah, not so much, but at the time it was fairly impressive. And so I'm considering it one of the first medium DMRs. The next step up was when Worker decided, why on earth are we making kits for other people's blasters? Let's make our own. And they came out with the Prophecy. Now, yes, this one was built back when I still thought painting a blaster mostly black was cool. It's not, kids. I just haven't gotten around to repainting it. And it's a wall hanger because, as we will get to, it's largely obsolete. But this is a Prophecy, and it was Worker's shell that would take any of the kits that they had made for the Retaliator. And obviously, as you can see, there are all kinds of cosmetic kits for it. This one makes it look like a anemic Barrett. This one was top prime. I didn't actually put a pump kit on it, but there were pump kits for it, and it could take all of their expanded plunger kits and all of their half dart kits. This has some manner of a sealed breech kit in it, and it could definitely get you higher power. There was still a limit because you still had a relatively small plunger tube, but larger than we had previously, and so this became that. The other thing that this had was what is essentially kind of like a power stock back in the day. It's got a much longer spring that goes back into the plunger tube in the stock, and that made for more efficient springs. A longer, heavier spring is better than a short, heavy spring, and it makes for less of a prime but more power and physics and math and all of that. So that was kind of the next upgrade there, was having that longer, narrower spring that we will continue to see a lot in future blasters. So that was the next iteration. And you can see it is just that. And obviously everything that this was made was built on the R&D that went into this. First, our stuff of building expanding plunger tubes and pump grips from stuff in hardware stores, and then Worker making it all injection molded and fancy kits and milled and aluminum and all of that. But it was built a lot on our R&D, which you could take that or leave it. I may touch on that later. But then along came Dartzo, and they came out with the Dartzo Pro, which was meant to be a high-end, high-performance Springer, as opposed to the Nexus or the Striker, which were cheap buy in Walmart off-the-shelf ones. These ones were meant to be a lot more powerful, and they had a lot more features. So they had teardown options, they had quick spring swap, they had used a standard buffer tube, a lot of that you see in the Nexus and all of that. But it had sealed breech and all that. I never understood the sloppy prime, never liked that. But once again, you can see it's there, down to the slope in the front. It's a Prophecy, which then technically makes it, you know, similar to this. And so again, the R&D for this was clearly built on the R&D for these, or if it wasn't, they were absolute fools because the R&D existed. But I'd be willing to bet anything that they indeed looked at what existed, what had been done, and then came up with their own design. And that was the Mark I. It would take long darts or short darts. The Mark 1.1 improved some of the internals to make it work better with a larger variety of darts. They would eventually abandon that entirely, and I'm with them on that, but we will get into that later. They then went to the 1.2, and that's how you know it's clearly an iteration of this. They had the 1, the 1.1, the 1.2. They fully understand that this is just an improved iteration of this, or potentially improved depending on how you feel about it. Still has the teardown feature, but they got rid of the buffer tube in exchange for a standard end strike attachment point, stock attachment point. Which I'm kind of curious how they got away with that, but it is still just this. If you look where the grips line up, it's the same, but the magwell doesn't. However, if you line up the magwells, now the prime, that all lines up, and where the spring ends up lines up. So this is in fact the same as Turtles as this. It's just been shifted forward slightly. But again, this is built on this, was built on this, was built on this. And so we see that evolution through what I'm referring to as the medium DMRs. And in my opinion, and this is the one that might get controversial, I'm actually going to put the Harrier down as a medium DMR. Again, because if you look at the size, it's more comparable. It's fairly comparable. And so the amount of plunger volume that's in there, the amount of prime that you get, all of that is very similar. And while you can get a lot of power out of this if you put a really heavy spring into it, people have discovered that it doesn't last as long. It wears out the internals, which to me says this was not engineered to operate on the super high levels that we will see in the heavy DMRs, that this was meant for what I would classify as medium DMR levels of performance. So your 5v5, your 200, 250 is where this is really meant to be, I believe. We can get more out of it, but I would argue that it's not intended for it. It wasn't designed for it, and so that's why I'm putting it down under the medium. And again, it's, in my opinion, clearly built off of the R&D of stuff that existed before it, but did it really quite magnificently. One of the things is they finally abandoned full-length darts, which I believe is a good thing, is a good thing, because I believe that backwards compatibility to the full-length darts was limiting what you could get. Some of the issues that these blasters have, I believe, stem from the fact that they had to be engineered to take full-length darts, and they finally just abandoned that. And this one they did, and I believe that is the right choice. I believe this one of the reasons this is the superior blaster is because it's half dart only, and so it gets to ignore a lot of the engineering shortfalls and pitfalls and issues that you get from having to be able to use both. So that's my thoughts on that, and that's my belief in the evolution that we see here in what I would classify as the medium DMRs. Now there's lots of other blasters that would obviously fall into this category that I didn't put on the table. We've got things like the Fire Phoenix also I think would fall into here. The Tryon, I'm not sure whether I would actually put it here or light. Feel free to bicker about that in the comments, whether you feel the Tryon is truly medium or if it goes under light because it has slam fire and some other various features. I would also argue that the Talon Claw is meant to be a medium DMR. It's, again, roughly that same size. Obviously, it has probably a larger plunger tube than any of these, and thus probably a higher end performance. But it doesn't have the level of performance we see in the heavy DMRs. So once again, I think this was intended for the medium range that, 5v5, 200, 250 area is what this is really meant for. It's lighter, it's more compact, so it's really good for that type of play. So I'm arguing that's where it goes. Same thing with things perhaps like the Lynx and various other of the smaller ones. Though you could probably make an argument that no, really with the potential of this, it might actually go in the heavy. It's just really small, and so you want to call it medium because you're sizest. I don't know. Anyway, feel free to bicker about that in the comments. What I don't want to see is bickering about the legality of the use of R&D, which we'll particularly see in the heavier DMRs next week. So stay tuned for that, and thank you for watching.